The history of the development of the first heavy German tanks is often overshadowed by the mighty Tiger I and II that entered production later. The problem is that these earlier projects are very poorly documented, and the fact they didn't make it past the prototype stage doesn't help either, as very little photographic evidence of them exists. One of the earliest 30-ton heavy tank projects was the VK30.01H. Despite the resources invested in its development and the production of components for 8 vehicles, the project was eventually cancelled in favour of the Tiger tank. Nonetheless, the VK30.01H was a vital stepping stone in the German heavy tank development program. The first notable German attempt to develop a heavy tank can be traced back to the K-Wagen project in 1917. It was envisioned as a massive breakthrough vehicle weighing approximately 120 tons, armed with 4 77mm guns and numerous machine guns. The project faced several challenges, including a late start, limited resources, and production deficiencies. As a result, only 2 such vehicles were partially completed before the end of the First World War. After the First World War, the German industrial infrastructure was ravaged and completely worn out. Given the economic and infrastructural challenges, it would take considerable time for the Germans to consider proposing and undertaking heavy tank development. The development was finally restarted by the German Army Weapons Agency in 1935. 2 years later, Henschel was instructed to start developing a 30-ton tank. While initially, it was planned to arm this heavy tank with a high-velocity 7.5cm gun, this idea was abandoned, and the Germans decided to reuse the Panzer IV's 7.5cm L-24 gun. Due to the weight limitation of 30 tons, the armour thickness was limited to 50mm. Although relatively thin by later standards, this thickness was considered sufficient to protect against most anti-tank weapons prevalent during that pre-war era. The early heavy tank project work would evolve into the Durchbruchswagen, or simply DW. The project is poorly documented nowadays, and as a result, not much information is available about it, but its development did not go beyond the prototype stage. Despite this slight setback, the German army officials were satisfied with the progress and decided to expand and improve upon it. In 1938, a specification for another 30-ton heavy tank project was issued. To speed up development time, this new vehicle was to incorporate many components taken from the DW project. This included the armament, armour thickness, overall hull design and internal layout. However, some new components were introduced, such as a new suspension system and a better engine. During the initial stages of the project, there were discussions about the armament of the tank. Due to the weight limitations, there was no space to install stronger and heavier armament, so the tank was again equipped with a short 7.5cm gun. This vehicle received the official designation of Panzerkampfwagen 6. In October of 1940. Given its connection to its predecessor, it was also codenamed DW. However, the codename was later changed to VK30.01. VK stands for Vollketten, which means fully tracked, the number 30 represented its weight in metric tons, and the number 1 indicated that this was the first version of a 30-ton tank from Henschel. To distinguish it from another similar project that shared the same VK30.01 designation, it received the H prefix, indicating its developer Henschel. For the production of the VK30.01, several companies were contacted. One of the largest of them, Krupp, was responsible for providing the hull, superstructure and turret components, while Henschel was in charge of the final assembly. Initially, Krupp was supposed to provide components for 3 hulls and superstructures without the turrets. Once completed, these vehicles were intended for drive tests and were assembled by Henschel using weight ballast instead of the turret. In January of 1940, Krupp received a new order to produce components for a total of 8 vehicles, including the 3 already ordered, expected to be delivered between July and October of 1941. The last fully completed hull arrived at Henschel in November of 1941, while the last turret arrived in late January 1942. Due to workforce shortages at Henschel, there were concerns about delays in the final assembly, and because of this, it was decided that only 4 vehicles would be fully built. 2 were to be completed in March of 1942, and the remaining 2 the following month. The completion of the remaining 4 vehicles was planned for the future, but never occurred due to the various delays and the low priority of the project. The VK30.01 chassis shared its overall layout with other German tank designs. The front part of the hull housed the transmission, followed by the crew compartment and the engine. The front hull, including the glacis plate, was designed to be heavily armoured to protect the vital components and crew from enemy fire. It was fully enclosed, meaning there were no access hatches located on the glacis plate armour. However, to allow the crew to escape in case of emergencies, escape hatches were added on the hull sides, just behind the first set of return rollers. The VK30.01 utilised a torsion bar suspension system. This type of suspension was also employed by the DW, but there were some notable differences between the two. The VK30.01 featured 7 interleaving road wheels, which contributed to improved weight distribution and overall driving performance. This design choice, although somewhat complex, offered advantages in terms of the tank's manoeuvrability and stability due to improved ground pressure distribution. To ensure effective shock dampening, shock absorbers were installed on the first 2 and the last 2 road wheels of the VK30.01. Initially, it was equipped with road wheels having a diameter of 500 mm. However, in January 1940, these were replaced with larger wheels measuring 700 mm in diameter. The VK30.01 had a front drive sprocket, a rear idler, and 3 return rollers. The VK30.01 superstructure was square-shaped and fully enclosed, with the driver's vision port positioned on the left side of the front plate. On the opposite side, a machine gun ball mount was installed. Surviving photographs indicate that not all vehicles were equipped with a machine gun ball mount or protective driver vision port. Instead, a simple round-shaped metal cover was added in place of the machine gun port on some vehicles, while the driver's vision port was left open or covered with a glazed window. Given that only 4 vehicles were ever fully completed, the Germans likely did not bother adding such components to the remaining 4 incomplete vehicles. The VK30.01 was powered by a Maybach HL116 engine, which provided 300 horsepower at 3000 RPM. With a weight of 32 tons, it could reach a maximum speed of 35 km an hour on good roads. The fuel load of 408 litres provided an operational range of around 150 km. Alternative power units were proposed during the development. However, it is unclear whether any of these engines were mounted in the vehicles that were built. The VK30.01 turret was built using 6 welded angled plates. The front hexagonal-shaped armour plate housed the main armament, with its curved gun mantlet. On the turret sides, small observation ports were installed. To protect the rear from possible enemy infantry attacks, 2 pistol ports were present. In contrast to other German tanks, such as the Panzer III and IV, the VK30.01's commander's cupola was much smaller in size. To provide the commander with a good view of the surroundings, a rotating ring with 7 small periscopes was used. Due to weight limitations and nothing more capable being available at the time, the Germans decided to arm the VK30.01 with the 7.5 cm KWK-37 L24 gun. This gun was primarily designed to engage fortified positions using high explosive rounds, and the ammunition load ranged between 90 to 100 rounds. Besides the main gun, the VK30.01 had at its disposal 2 7.92mm MG-34 machine guns for use against infantry. One machine gun was placed in a coaxial configuration with the main gun and was fired by the gunner. Another machine gun was positioned on the right side of the superstructure and was fired by the radio operator. The main armament was effective in the early stages of the war. However, by 1941 standards, it was becoming obsolete, particularly in terms of its anti-tank capabilities. The Germans attempted to test the installation of several different armaments. As these would require extensive turret modification, nothing came of them. One proposal included the installation of a 75/55mm tapered bore gun known as Waffe 0725. The idea was quickly discarded as the gun itself was never adopted for service. This vehicle was well protected by early German standards, with the front, side and rear hull armour being 50mm thick. The superstructure featured the same armour thickness. The top of the superstructure, including the engine compartment, was 25mm thick. The turret also shared the same thickness as the armour, except for the top, which was only 15mm thick. The VK30.01 had a crew of 5, which included the commander, gunner and loader, who were positioned in the turret, and the driver and radio operator in the hull. The driver was seated on the left side of the front hull, and opposite him sat the radio operator. The gunner, as on most German tanks, was positioned to the left of the main armament, and the loader was to the right. Lastly, the commander was positioned to the rear of the turret under his cupola. While the construction of the 8 ordered vehicles was underway, the rapid developments on the Eastern Front during 1941 led to a drastic change of priorities. The Soviet tanks proved to be superior to German designs. The Germans recognized the need to counter the Soviet tanks and responded by introducing improved tanks and self-propelled tank hunters. In 1942, the decision to prioritize the Tiger led to the termination of all other heavy tank projects. The completed vehicles were reused as training vehicles, and the remaining 4 VK30.01 hulls were repurposed. None of the 4 fully completed VK30.01 would ever see combat. However, technically speaking, some of their components would see action, but not as part of the tank. Some of the VK30.01 turrets were repurposed and reused as static emplacement bunkers. The concept of using the turrets in such a role was first mentioned in the early drawings of the Atlantic Wall in 1942. It was not until 1944 that the first such emplacement was constructed. On the 11th of February, 6 turrets were in the process of being modified by Krupp for this role. The 7.5cm recoil guard was reinforced, and small metal tubes were welded onto the turret sides. These served as connection points for camouflage nets. The emplacements were stocked with approximately 168 rounds for the main gun and 21,000 rounds for the auxiliary machine gun. 4 of these modified turrets were placed on the Atlantic Wall, while the remaining 2 were used on the Siegfried defense line. At least 2 of these turrets were captured intact by the Allies. 2 VK30.01 chassis were reused to construct the massive 12.8cm Selbstfahrwaffe L61 self-propelled gun, known today as the Schwere Emil. For its construction, the 2 available VK30.01 chassis were lengthened to accommodate the 12.8cm flak 40 main armament and an open-top superstructure with its crew. These 2 vehicles saw action on the Eastern Front during 1942 and 1943. Given the urgency of the Tiger heavy tank projects, no more modifications were ordered. One of the 2 vehicles employed on the Eastern Front was captured by the Soviets near Stalingrad, and it is preserved to this day in Patriot Park in Moscow. 1 or more VK30.01 vehicles were modified to test various trench digging equipment. Such tests were carried out at the start of 1944. The whole project appears to have stayed within the prototype stage, as no such vehicle was issued for troop use. The victorious Allies managed to get their hands on one such modified vehicle. When the war ended in Europe, the Allies captured at least one complete vehicle and one trench-digging modification. The fate of these two and the remaining vehicles beyond that point is unknown, but they do not seem to have survived to this day. According to some sources, one VK30.01 hull was present at the Sennelager ranges in Germany at least until 1980. This concludes our video on the VK30.01. What do you think of this early German heavy tank project? Would it have been effective if pressed into service during the early stages of the war? Share your opinions in the comments section. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to subscribe to stay updated on future content. If you'd like to contribute further, consider supporting us on Patreon or PayPal. Your contributions help us create more engaging videos. Until next time, stay focused and stay tuned.